Hello everyone and welcome to the first of the painting videos for having our Sisters Army all done from Raging Heroes. The first video we're going to be tackling a sergeant or a squad leader, and we're going to show you the very basic color scheme that we're going to be doing for this house army of ours. So a lot of contrast, dry brushing, a little bit of airbrushing, everything that we can do to make an army look good on the table from the camera eye view or the player eye view is what we're going to be aiming for. So don't expect a lot of in-depth highlighting and stuff like that. We are very bare bones on this, and we're doing the basic of what would be acceptable, or maybe not even acceptable. It doesn't matter about acceptability. It's more what would get an army on the table with the least amount of steps. And what we're trying to do here is give you an army that is complete, is fully painted, and leaves you plenty of scope to revisit at any point and decide, I have more details I would like to add, let's go do that. So let's get stuck in to our squad leader. So our first step on our sister here, we're going to be airbrushing atop this primer. Now the primer we've used here is Mechanicus Standard Grey, so it's just the aerosol can, and we've just given the entire miniature a coat of that just to get us a sort of mid to dark tone, sort of lower. And what we're going to be doing as our first step after that is airbrushing on a light grey. Now the grey we're going for here is Spaceship Exterior from Army Painter. This is being put into an airbrush mixed, I think it's about 2:1 with AK acrylic thinner. This is a really good thinner, very, very good. It works with nearly every acrylic paint that I've currently used on the market. So what we've done is mix that roughly 2:1 into my airbrush, which is one of the Green Stuff World 1 airbrushes, which is the 0.3mm needle. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to give this more or less an entire coat, but not directly on or underneath. We're looking at making this sort of the upper main color. So let's go for it. And that is essentially the level of coat that we're looking for here. A good couple of passes over the top to really bring the grey up, and leaving enough shadow underneath to make it a bit more interesting looking. That's going to work well for us later on when we come to putting the cloak, the colors onto the cloak and so on. But right now, we're going to have to let this dry because this acrylic thinner takes about 5-10 minutes to completely settle with the paint onto the miniature. So if you're doing this in batches, this is perfect because you'll start with one. By the time you've got 5 or 10 base coated, your first one's going to be ready for the next step, and so on and so forth. So remember, we're always aiming to work in a production line with this method. So we'll let this dry, clean the airbrush out as we would if we'd finished a batch of 5 or 10 of them, and when we come back, we'll look at our next applications. With the airbrushing of the spaceship exterior now dry, we're going to move on to the next step. And the next step is very simple. It's going to be a contrast paint, and we're going to be using Apothecary White for this. We're going to give this entire model a coat, and then let that dry, and then we're moving on. Apothecary White works really well with this because we're already working on the grayscale anyway, and we're going to be following it up with a bit of a closer to white, like a slightly off white on top of it. So it's just going to be a case of giving the whole miniature a coat of this, every detail including the cloak, because it'll all help in the end. With the Apothecary White contrast paint down and now dry, we can have a look and just briefly see what results we've got. So, it complements the spaceship exterior paint rather well. It just gets into everywhere we need it to without, even where it's pulling, it's not too bad. So that's grand. We're going to move on now to a dry brush step, and for this we're going to be using Citadel Praxetti White, the dry paint, and I'm using a fairly large dry brush for this one, so we'll just get it ready here, get a bit more on the brush than that, and just work until we have a nice fine texture. And then it's going to be a simple case of dry brushing basically the whole model, because we're not too worried about hitting the cloak or anything like that. Everything we do will help subsequent steps. So that's where we're getting the most economy out of every step we do. So every step up to this point is going to help when we get to another contrast color here in a moment. So especially on the cloak. So we want to make sure that this really becomes like, this dry brush really sort of makes the miniature look like white, has white armor on, even with this little bit of shading and sort of off-white light gray base coat that we've applied. So again, don't be too cautious about this step either. Just make sure you've got a nice consistent go at it, and that we've picked out all the edges that we want. Particularly up on these arms and stuff like that, want to make sure we're going perpendicular to the detail so we get that nice sharp edge. I would say that's probably enough. Don't want to do too much more than that. We have enough of a standout feature there that the armor now looks a lot more white than it did originally. Now with that done, we can move on to one of our first big main colors. And for this, we're going to be using the contrast paint Blood Angels Red. And this is going to encompass her cloak, hood, and the tabard as well, I believe. So make sure I have an appropriate brush selected. And it's got a bit of water in it, so I'll put some of this onto my palette. And we don't want to be too cautious with this either. Obviously we need to be tidy around the detail on her armor, but on the cloak we can be practically as heavy as we want to be, because every detail on the cloak will be going gold later on. With the Blood Angels Red now dry, we can now check out this great contrast we have between the white armor and all the red cloth. And I love this stage of painting these miniatures because it could almost be, like a very statuesque sort of, the way Raging Heroes kind of advertise their stuff these days, where it's a 3D render with a few colors on it. I like that style. I think it's a good way to show off some 3D models. Now, anyway, enough of that. We have a couple of base coating steps that we need to move on to. So the first one is going to be the gold. And for this, we're going to be using Army Painter's Bright Gold. And it's a bit of a thin color, but it works pretty well. And it's a nice high gold. So what we do is we just basically put it down, then we put a wash over it. And because we're trying to go for a simple scheme, that is basically that stage done. So let's get a small-ish brush in here. And what we're looking to do is basically everything from sword hilts, pommels. We're going to be picking out the detail on the cloak here as well. Some of these items here, like her grenades and stuff hanging from her belt, including a few of the clasps and the symbology, and on the back. So it's going to be a fairly long step, but it's a step that immediately helps the look of the miniature and gives us this lovely, rich looking appearance, and that is what we're aiming for. So we're just going to take our time and just get all this in, and then we can move on to the next color. After we've finished applying the gold, we can move on before it's completely dry, and we're going to be moving on to some metal work, which will be based with Lead Belcher. So again, it's just a case of putting some of this onto my palette and just going for it. Now this doesn't have to be a very tedious step. There's a lot more gold on the color scheme than there is metalwork, so it's just a case of picking out where we want. So pretty much taking the entire of her sword here, and we want to give it a coat of this. And to be fair, I'm probably using too small a brush for this step, so we'll very quickly switch out to a slightly larger one and get a bit more paint onto my palette. That way we're trying to make ourselves efficient with time here as well as getting a quick finish. So make sure we get right up there and be careful just as we get to the edge of where that gold is. So I think that's all the lead belcher we're going to do, which is fine. We're then going to very quickly work on her face, and because it's only skin, we're just going to be hitting this very quickly with a contrast paint, which is Dark Oath Flesh, so nothing too complicated there. Again, trying to keep it simple, streamlined, something that we can do and repeat time and time again until we have an army painted. So that's the approach, let's not forget that. So again, just this Dark Oath, just work it into the inner part of that hood. And I think that will do, because once that's dry, that's going to look quite decent with the shading and stuff that's already present. So with that done, which is a very quick step, it's different on some of the other miniatures because there's more going on. We're going to move on to another contrast paint, which is Skeleton Horde, and this is going to be for the tabard details and seals and stuff like that. So it's also going to go on to the gold. So we're going to start with these two lengths of cloth here, which to me are more like parchments. So we'll give them a coat of this. And it doesn't matter too much if it overruns onto the red. It does obviously matter if it overruns onto the armor, because we don't want it to stain that armor. But onto the red, it's not that big a deal. Same up here. And again, this Skeleton Horde is also going to go over our gold details, but we might just give that a little longer to dry. So we'll do those off camera, come back, and then move on to our next step. With the Skeleton Horde now down over the gold, we now can see, again, we've got a bit more shading on the gold. It looks a bit richer. It's still drying, of course, but it'll get there. So there is basically there's basically one step left, and we're going to be using Null Oil for that. So again, sometimes it surprises me how quick some of these schemes can be, and I understand there's going to be a few people are going to say, you know, well, it's a bit too simple or whatever. Don't forget, guys, you can always come back to a miniature. This is taken from the idea of we want an army quick, so we're trying to keep a scheme nice and simple. So on the sword, just get that Null Oil on there. I'll work it onto the underside and the back. Make sure we get a good approach there. Like that. And then we have a little bit on the gun. Like that. And then just as an added thing, just to add a bit more shading, what we could do here is we'll put a bit of Null Oil into this softer part of what I would say is the corset, or the front of a corset. Like that. Now that's an optional thing. I like it because when even at a distance, it's still present. And what you could do if you have the time later on to revisit the miniature is just paint in those fleur-de-lis in a gold as well. But apart from that, once that's dry, I would argue that that's ready for the tabletop, particularly in amongst all the other miniatures that will be painted in a very similar style. You know, from an army perspective, this should look fine. So we're going to let it dry. I'm just going to paint the base black, and then we'll have a look at the finished product. So here we have our sister squad leader, or sister superior if you want to call her that, ready for her basing and a matte varnish once the entire army has been done. So like I said, it's a very simple scheme. You don't want to be labouring too long on any one particular detail. Contrast paints are your friend. Simple metallics to accentuate certain details bring a lot more interest to what is essentially a very simple scheme with a very limited color palette. So in general, what we can say is that this miniature is ready for the table once the basing material is down, but also is in a prime position to be revisited at a later date if you think you're happy with the scheme but you want to improve on the actual result. You could go in and do some hard edge highlighting on that white. We could do some edging or highlighting on the red a bit more. There's tons that can be done, but for getting a miniature and getting an army ready, this is the approach I like to take, because again, it always lets you come back to it later on and improve upon it. So I hope you've enjoyed this one, and take care, stay safe, leave your comments down below, and I will see you in the next one.